det är någon som önskar, tror jag, tolkning. There is someone who would like to have interpretation into Danish. Yes, so we are Danish. And we could also then add that unfortunately today we will have no interpretation into German. Es gibt leider keine Übersetzung ins Deutsche wegen Krankheit. So I'll try to speak as clearly as possible. Right, so welcome to this evening lecture in our last summer week of our summer season, where we have focused so much on intuition and eternity and the highest analyses, which you have heard of this week. And I would like to connect to that topic as well and talk a little about our connectedness, perhaps also about our disconnectedness, and back again to connectedness, how we all belong together. And I would actually like to start with the highest viewpoint that we could have, that we can't experience yet, at least most of us, but we can read about it. Martinus has told us about it. He describes to us what is the highest level of unity like. So I would like to show this, if technology works. This is what Martinus says already in the preface to the first volume of the Book of Life, where he actually gives an introduction to his works, but also tells us how did he get access to all this knowledge, everything that he wrote about, all those pages and symbols. And of course, that's a longer text, and he describes it at length also in other passages and in other books, but just these short lines to begin with. He describes it like this: I saw that the universe constitutes one single enormous living being, in which all other beings are, one and all, organs, and that we, all people, animals, plants, and minerals, form one family, and that we, figuratively speaking, are of the same flesh and blood. And I think these lines are very powerful, and they really tell us what it's all about. This is our eternal connectedness, which he saw. This isn't something that he sort of pondered on, thought about, or wrote a philosophic article about in the academic world, that it could be like this, or create a model, and so on. This is something like he saw and experienced the way we experience sunshine and rain and everyday things. And he also says, of course, this is something that we will experience too, when we eventually, after a long journey, will access, or will get cosmic consciousness. And it's very impressive also the way he describes it, that it's people, animals, plants, and minerals, as you all know, that it really encompasses everything. And he often says in his lectures, which you can listen to in Danish on our website, on the Martinus Institute's website, he really can say in a very simple and straightforward way that I see God in everyone. When he was standing here or in the institute and giving lectures, he just said, I see God in all of you. And you will also learn that when you look into the eyes of another human being or just another living being, you will see God speaking to you. So this is the starting point and perhaps the ending point, the highest level of unity, you could say, that we can experience. And we also see it here in the symbol, the eternal world picture, number 11, and what we sometimes call the main picture, the main symbol as well. We will see the Godhead, sort of everything, because everything is contained within the Godhead. We see the Godhead in the middle. We see all the individual living beings experiencing ourselves as separate or individual living beings due to the X2, as we know, the capacity of creating and experiencing, but never actually separated from this perfect circle, always within. We see no nations or groups or enemies or divisions. And we will just have to imagine, we know how many different species we are on Earth, how many different insects, plants, minerals, and of course many human beings we just have on this planet. And then we have to widen that and include all the universe. We'll see that's a very large perspective. And he describes that further in the 7th volume of the Book of Life, like this. The I in all living beings are thus one and the same thing. As this something cannot be divided, it is here a fact that all beings, on account of this something or I, are, from a cosmic point of view, inextricably connected. Here, all living beings thus form a cosmic, inseparable unit. It is, as previously mentioned, this unit that forms the eternal Godhead. And as I said, it's later on in his main work. And again, we can notice that this is from a cosmic point of view. If this would always be the case, if we would always experience ourselves as so connected, then we would have no contrasts. We know that in this great spiral circle, all beings are at different stages of development. They are inhabitants of different kingdoms. Otherwise, we wouldn't have contrasts. We couldn't experience anything in the end. So it is from the cosmic point of view that we know that we are connected. And it's sort of especially interesting to us, since this is the reunion that we are longing for at our stage, as we know. This is the thing that is a light to us. So this is the highest point of view. We are not divided. We can look at each other here in this room and we can perceive that we have different physical bodies. But as has been pointed out this week or this season in several lectures, this is just what we see. It's not who we really are. But of course, we are not yet there, so to experience us as so inextricably connected as he did. Martinus sometimes tells also about providence working together. For example, arranging everything that is happening on our earth right now, also political affairs and so on, that they can never have different opinions. One had just to compare that to our own governments or parties or even other groups. They are always united. They always are just directed towards doing God's will. They can't do anything else, so they can never differ. They are always together, which I think is inspiring. But we're not there yet. And still, I think when we are here in Klint, it's much easier to get a sort of foreshadowing of that coming unity. Because here many people come here, we share the interest in the analysis, the inspiration, the gratitude for reading those analyses. And so it's much easier and I think at least much more accessible to us to feel that here we have an inkling of our connectedness. And then when we go somewhere else, for example, in a large city, or it could be in Newcomers here, or it could be when we travel home. I live in Stockholm. I would perhaps say I have 2 homes, but one of my homes is in Stockholm. And when I go to the train station or to the airport, I think that perhaps I'm not the only one who feels slightly, what would you call it, sort of confused. When you suddenly bump into the ordinary world and you see so many people and you're not really interested in, or they are not interested in me, and we just need to navigate. We have some kind of traffic rules. We don't get too close to each other. We would never sit down at another person's table at the train station and ask them about their opinion of reincarnation or life. But we could do that here. So you see, in normal life, we really don't experience ourselves perhaps as so close as we can do here. And that is sometimes a contrast. And Martinus also explains to us that this is normal. This is how we experience reality. He says in this quote, "Every one of us human beings thus, through our physical and psychical senses, experiences ourselves as an individual unit. We are separated from other living beings, as we can see here. But, again, this sense of separation is thus just an imagined contrast to an absolute reality, where the beings are inextricably joined in one unit." So again, he uses these words. They are really, really tied together in this connectedness. And here he also uses the word absolute reality as a contrast perhaps to the reality where we live, which is of course real enough to us. But you have heard this week and in the other week of people who have had cosmic glimpses. I will come back to that soon as well. And also people who have had near-death experiences, who often use those terms. It's difficult for them to describe what they have experienced, but they often feel that where they were when they were dead, that was the absolute, that was a real reality. It was more real than this world. This is a pattern that comes back. And I just thought of a woman writer that Ampulla mentioned on Tuesday, Selma Lagerlöf, a Swedish well-known author. I'm sure you knew. She was often in Denmark, actually. She was interested in spiritual things, like so many other people were in the 20th century, or at the end of the 19th century. But she didn't really have any spiritual experiences, and she wanted to have that. She wrote extensive letters to her two women lovers, as you also heard about. But once she had a real spiritual experience, and that was when her mother died, because then she felt she was very close to her mother. It was a woman's world, and she wanted to come into contact with her. She was also depressed because of the First World War, and doubted a little about what the world was going to end, if there was a meaning to it. So she was depressed because of the world situation, but also because her mother had died. And then she saw, or she perceived, that her mother contacted her during the funeral in church. So she really felt she could get into contact with her mother, but she also felt, and that is perhaps the interesting thing here, she suddenly had the sense that we all who are here, we just play a play in our role play. And we need to play that to the end. But it's not the real world. Where her mother was the absolute reality. That was the word she used. And we play a play, we have a role to play, but it's not the real world where we are. And that was a very strong experience, because he wrote about it. And something that many people can feel. And I just wanted to illustrate that as well with, this is actually a winter day in outside Stockholm, where people just, where it was quite cold. It was in 2021, so it was last year. And people just get together on the ice, because it was interesting to walk on the ice or skate or ski, and nobody knew each other almost. As you can see, it looks quite without any special planning. But if that would be recalled in a live review, I imagine that I would be able to recall every detail of that slightly blurred picture. Perhaps everyone who was there, the snow, perhaps birds, lots of details that I wouldn't remember now, because that is what stays in this dimension of real reality. And it could also be that those people who just think they occasionally are on the ice together might have some connection that we don't know. So Martinus says here in this quote that man's experience of life is really the experience of a gigantic drama, and a drama in which we are all members of the cast. But not just members of the cast, we are also the audience. And I think we are also the director, and we are also lots of the technicians and the rest. But he stresses especially that we play a part, but we are also the audience. And I suppose it's this observing audience that can also later recall all the details in just an ordinary winter day. As you can see, we have contrasts in Sweden as far as seasons are concerned. But as I said, some people have had the possibility and occasion to just look behind the curtains a little, behind the scenes. Sometimes when you go into nature, this is a sunset also on a winter day, you feel that if you just could, there is another reality behind it, and if you just press a button or just push the curtain a little, you would see the real reality. It hasn't happened to me, though, even if you sometimes feel very, very connected out in nature. But I think we have proof that we are more connected here in Klint than we think, because when I prepared this PowerPoint, I had an example of a man who had had such a very strong experience of unity. And then actually Ole Terkelsen mentioned him this morning, and we had no idea of this, and that is Richard Morris Buck. So it seems that we have some kind of secret connection, but it's also because he has such an interesting experience. It was a long time ago, I think it was in the 1870s, that he experienced this. He was, if I remember correctly, a psychiatrist. And he just described something very powerful that happened to him. And I will just read it to you as an example, that we can see what this connectedness can be like, can be experienced, how it can be experienced. So this is his words. He puts it into the third person because he wrote a book later on, but it is Morris Buck that experienced this. Let's see if this stays. So this is how it goes. All at once, without warning of any kind, he found himself wrapped around as it were, by a flame-colored cloud. For an instant he thought of fire, some sudden conflagration in the great city. The next, he knew that the lies were within himself. This is an experience that many mystics share, that they think they are on fire. And it goes on. Directly afterwards came upon him a sense of exaltation or immense joyousness, accompanied or immediately followed by an intellectual illumination quite impossible to describe. So it was a strong feeling, a very, very strong feeling of joy, but also intellectual insights. And here you see just a little more, it's a longer experience. Among other things, he saw and knew that the cosmos is not dead matter, but a living presence, that the soul of man is immortal, that the universe is so built and ordered that without any peradventure, all things work together for the good of each and all, that the foundation principle of the world is what we call love, and that the happiness of everyone is, in the long run, absolutely certain. And then you can compare that with Martinus's words that the keynote of the universe is love. And he was so inspired by this that he later on collected other experiences. He studied experiences by philosophers, poets, religious leaders, including Buddha, Muhammad, and Jesus, but also Walt Whitman and philosophers, and wrote this book, Cosmic Consciousness, in 1901, which is really interesting that it was studied in detail in those days. Reading this more than 100 years later, and being a woman, you can notice that there is almost no woman included in the book, which he also comments on, actually. He says, well, he had 2 cases, and one of them didn't want to be included, and the other one he wasn't sure about. And of course, this doesn't make the book less interesting. It's the secondary pole, it's the intellectual side of the human beings that we study. But still, I think it's interesting to complement his work, to supplement his work, perhaps you would say, by also collecting women's experiences of cosmic consciousness or similar experiences of unity and connectedness, which I think would be an interesting book. There would be one difference, though. One difference between men and women mystics. I think that women wouldn't have such long beards. But I think they could say quite wise things even if they don't have that. And I would just like to show one example, because we are going back later on to Martinus's work. But one example of a very, very original and inspiring and strong figure, I'm sure you all know about, is Hildegard von Bingen. It's a long time ago. It's almost 1,000 years ago. But she wrote music. She wrote medical books. She had visions. She saw angels, and she also got the permission from the Pope to write about these visions. And she has some quotes that are always connected to this sense of unity, which I just found inspiring. This is just one of them, and I think when you read this, you realize that time doesn't really matter, nor does gender in that matter, for that matter. It is the same journey that we make, and we experience more or less the same things. Perhaps the words are a little bit different. She says, or she wrote, "Holy Spirit, you are the mighty way in which everything that is in the heavens, on the earth, and under the earth is penetrated with connectedness, is penetrated with relatedness." And she also wrote, "Humanity, take a good look at yourself. Inside you got heaven and earth and all of creation. You're a world. Everything is hidden in you." And I also thought about this symbol by Martinus when you read that we know that Martinus says we have a whole universe within us. What's above us is also within us. And when we truly understand that, we will also see that everything is living in the universe. She also wrote lots of music and said that the inspiration to her music came from angels, which is difficult for music historians to cope with. But they try to find other musicians that inspired her, because the music is quite original. But she had the answers. They came from the angels that she heard. But this is 1,000 years ago. I imagine, at least sometimes we speculate about earlier lives, that some of us might have been like Hildegard or like other people living in monasteries or nunneries, taking part of repetition of prayers and rituals and trying to live a spiritual life, trying to help other people, also trying to actually follow Christ or other religious leaders and trying to do good. And doing that for many, many lives, perhaps. But that has for many people also turned into something that rather belongs to the past, especially because it's ritualized and doesn't really move in a way, but also because it's part more of a group religion, of a flock or a herd religion, than the religious viewpoint that we have today. I can mostly speak for Sweden and for Scandinavia, but in Sweden it's very, very personal to talk about spirituality. And if people believe in anything, it depends a little on the context where you are in, but For example, at a university, you can talk about many things, but I don't think I've ever heard people ask each other, because I have worked at a university for quite some time, what do you believe in, or what do you think happens after death? I think if you compare it, there are some areas that are very, very sort of intimate and difficult to talk about, like, for example, sex as a comparison. But I do think people would rather talk about sex at a university than to ask each other what they believe in. Because it's very intimate, it's personal, and it transgresses boundaries, perhaps. I think people feel very alone. And that's also what Martinus says here from another article called God's Voice. All beings are in reality alone until they experience God's voice. And perhaps we have had that connection in what Martinus calls the old world impulse. We did feel connected to this world impulse. We got nourishment, we got happiness, and we sort of strived on. But for the modern human being, and I think for many people who are here, it is no longer the source of nourishment that it has been. And it might be quite a comfort to see, this is a painting by Edvard Munch, by the way, young woman on the beach. It might be comforting to see that in some situations in life, it's natural that we actually feel quite alone, in a way that we haven't perhaps done for all our earlier development as human beings. And he goes on here, some quotes from the same article. We are alone through everything that we call karma, sorrow, illness, and pain, in all of the most serious situations in life. The being will always be on its own. All people will sooner or later experience situations where they will feel alone in the universe, in spite of having spouses, friends, and comrades. And I suppose we can recognize that, at least when you have some years behind you, that you have these situations where you really feel, in spite of having read inspiring books, in spite of having all sorts of good things happening to you, you might still feel very alone, especially if there is a crisis that you haven't counted with. It could be, he gives examples, it could be that somebody dies, it could be an illness, but it could also be other things, disappointments, that you feel that the one thing that you want, that you really want to do, that you really long for, that you might not be able to do that. Or it could just be anything, could be many different kinds of crises. It's something that we know, and Martinus then says, is it not this feeling of loneliness that makes the individual cry out to the universe after an unknown providence, or whisper a prayer to the Godhead? And we know that Martinus says that we have a religious instinct that has been activated already in the animal kingdom. This is not something that comes and goes. We have that instinct, but at our ages, as I said, it's quite difficult to put words to that. But when we are in danger or when we are alone, even if we perhaps don't even speak out loud, it's natural that we perhaps whisper a prayer to the Godhead. And he says it's typical of the materialistic or unfinished or dead world picture that we really don't know that we really are for this period of time alone, and we're not connected any longer. We're disconnected. We see, you know that this, we'll just see the other symbol in a minute. This is only a part, actually an auxiliary symbol, as Martinus said, of another symbol that shows the whole universe. But this is what we feel. It's black and white. We can only see natural processes. We don't really know who we are. You see the question marks above our eye. We don't know who we are. We don't know if there is a God. And we just feel that we are lonely and ask for help. The world seems perhaps cold and unfriendly. You could say that it's also in this physical world that we experience separation. You could compare that to a baby being born. that when you sort of get out of your mother's womb, I mean, before that you really have that sense. You are together physically. You stick together, and then of course you're separated, and you have to do it on your own. And this is what we have as well, and we know there's a meaning to that. Because we know, who are studying here, that this is the whole picture, and it looks of course so much more colorful and light and loving when we see that this part that we thought was life is only just a small part of a unit. And we're not disconnected as we thought. We are always connected to the Godhead that we see at the top. And Martinus tells us we have this providence that you can see here, sort of encompassing all of us at the whole journey that we make here through the plant kingdom, the animal kingdom, and the beginning of the real human kingdom eventually. But through all this passage, this connection or this door was never closed, but we experienced it that way. We are always connected. Our prayers were always heard, which is something that many people wouldn't believe, because they feel that nothing happens when you pray, or there is no one that you see that you can pray to, or there is no one that shows yourself to us if you pray. But Martinus tells us it is just our thought world that is limited. It's part of the whole, and he calls it also the eternal, cosmic, and organic connection between God and the Son of God. So it's this organic connection. And my microphone is not quite connected to me, but I hope it will stay. We see the spiritual plane above us. And this is something that we have believed in earlier in the old world impulse. We believe that perhaps in nunneries and monasteries or whatever, or in just as a normal human farmer or whatever we were. But since we lost the capacity of believing, we really must reconnect, you could say, to find that again. And in order to understand this, Martinus also tells us that our experience of life is built upon contrasts. If we didn't have this black and white picture, how could we experience the beautiful colors and the sensation of being one? If I would always be connected to my baby, how could we ever experience ourselves as, how could he, my two sons, how could they ever experience themselves as individual beings if they would always be sort of connected to me? I think it's good that we have a healthy disconnection as well in our adult lives. But Martinus explains this as well and says, our experience of life can exist only as a changing relationship to the two contrasts, light and darkness. And you could also translate that into connectedness and disconnectedness. So the relationship can be only either a journey towards the light or a journey towards the darkness, or what we experience as darkness. The driving force in this relationship is hunger, and the final aim is satiation. And this is from the 3rd volume of the Book of Life. And of course, you can really see, literally speaking, that it is a huge journey that we have made from minerals and plants for billions of years, or how many years, and then in the animal kingdom with all its different phases. And it's just right now that we are starting to recollect again. Let's put that back and see if this can be connected so that you can hear me. It is the world of the materia where we are separated, and we also experience ourselves as separate. And I guess that is what's so clear when people who have had near-death experiences tell us that this seems to be an unreal world, because on the other plane it was so clear that everything was connected, and very often they feel that everything, we are just encompassed by love, and all the differences that we have here, they don't really matter. But of course this is our learning place. We are at school, and we are meant to be here. and we have seen this symbol earlier as well, the road towards light. So we know that, again, this is a journey where we follow different kinds of, you could say perhaps, inspirational stars. I mean, we have had the humane world religions that really inspired us for so many years, and where we started to develop a feeling-based connection to God, to the divine, in different parts of the world. And then, of course, we also had natural science that also inspires us to get a lot of intellectual knowledge and interest in the world that surrounds us. And now at this stage, we see that this light inspires us to go on and to try to combine these two elements, combine our humane feeling, our wish to become better people, or to create a more humane world, and combine that with the logical thinking that we have learned in school and in different universities and educations. And when we see that, of course, we also know that there is a boundary here. We are no longer inhabitants of the animal kingdom. However, even if our bodies look perhaps more like animals, most of us would say we differ from animals in many respects, which also means that we, as I think Søren Olsen will talk more about tomorrow, we are in a way refugees between two kingdoms. We have some old habits of connectedness that we also need to reflect on and see they might not be useful to us any longer if we want to attain this cosmic connectedness. And that kind of connectedness is something that we also experience when we left the old traditions. Martinus uses parables and tales from the Bible, as you know, and one of them is the prodigal son, which he comes back to. We could also say the prodigal daughter, of course. Here you see again a winter's day in Sweden. And Martinus says, in the prodigal son's consciousness, there also arouse a kind of longing, a desire to leave behind the prevailing traditions, to leave his father and his parental home, to leave that what is safe, where we feel at home. For example, our old religious traditions, but it could also be other things. It could be our nations, I'll come back to that. Everything that we feel, this is familiar, this is where I belong, this is where I don't feel lonely. But we feel also this urge to leave it. And he says, what is the prodigal son's journey away from his father and his parental home, other than his journey towards materialism, towards forgetting about the Godhead and the consequent primitiveness and ignorance in areas of the spirit, which is in principle exactly the same as the expulsion from the Garden of Eden. So you could say, in one way, we have the great expulsion from the Garden of Eden when we are satiated in the spiral cycle by the light and just move on and begin a new spiral cycle. But at our stage of development, it's also really the stage where we feel right now, the lonely girl on the beach, where we feel that from now on, we need to develop an individual and conscious relationship to providence, to the Godhead, to what is around us. But the start of that journey is more like perhaps a protest, like teenagers, let's say, but that sort of just protest against the parents, even if they feel that they're secure, but they need to release themselves from the bond. If you have had, everyone who has had teenagers at home knows that it's quite difficult sometimes to understand those processes if you don't understand that it's really the bond that they need to liberate themselves from. So we have left on our own when we thought it was time. We were satiated with all the group traditions, everything that we didn't enjoy, again here in the animal kingdom. We felt perhaps security and safeness in the old animal herds. They look alike, they work together, it was all fine. They stick together, but it can also, of course, be a hindrance, something that stops us. And something that really matters, of course, is the development of the pole transformation that I will not go into, but since we change and become less and less one-poled beings, where women develop their intellectual sides, men as well develop their intellectual sides, we get more and more interest. Of course, it's less and less interesting just to stay in a herd and work with food and survival, but also perhaps to have a family. So in a way we need to, this is tricky today, we need to see that we have some old talent kernels that have been very, very useful in the first part of the animal kingdom that can be critical for us today when we want to find a new way of connectedness. Because what Martinus says, if we stick to that was useful in the animal kingdom, we will actually create what we see today, the doomsday in a way. Again, he uses the picture here of the prodigal son. Because if we continue to worship power on this journey, it will end in the principle of winter or lifeless or materialism. Also something that we need to go through. So he says here, the worship or cultivation of power instead of the origin of power thus led the eye to the reduction of consciousness called death, or the cold and lifeless season in the gigantic spiral cycles that forms the principle of winter. Here, the prodigal son is away from his father. So we can imagine our Father, our God, Godhead, providence being all this, all-encompassing love. And we, in this phase, actually create death, which doesn't exist in an absolute sense, but it exists in the way that it could be two beings, it could be two groups, two nations, which we see right now in the world at many places, just create darkness. And that belongs to that journey of the prodigal son. These two are really not connected to each other. They have no idea that we are in reality always part of the same unit. And I suppose many of us have felt that also in our personal lives, where perhaps with friends or colleagues or bosses at work, that we certainly don't feel that we are part of the same unit. We feel very different and very disconnected. He calls that symbol intolerance, and it's a very speaking symbol. We see that when we have intolerance, when we demonstrate the opposite of love, then we create darkness and we shut that connection out. And what he says, and I won't go into detail, because it looks quite idyllic with our different nations, and we can celebrate being Swedish or German or American or whatever, but he actually says that this is the wrong kind of connectedness and it belongs to the past. We have widened our horizons. We can travel around the earth, we trade with each other, we can listen to the same talk all over the earth. I know that young people play computer games with each other, probably adults too, all over the earth, all over the world, and never think about what nationalities they belong to. And still, Martinus says, still we cling to that idea that we have our own flock, our own herd, that kind of connectedness, which might seem harmless, but it actually, if it goes further, as we can clearly see now, leads to war. And he even says we fail the world state that we would like to build up. So this is just part of it, to realize that the instinct-based connectedness is something that belongs to the past, and that we should try to humanize, at least, to make it more and more harmless, and probably then it will disappear, so that we will all have the same flag and speak the same world language. Then we don't need all those interpretations. So he says here about this, and the more man worshipped the nation as an independent unit, the more he betrayed the great New World stage, which he could not possibly dispense with or avoid living in. We need our world state. The result of this must inevitably become what the world's Redeemer had already betokened with a disruption, a day of doom. So internationalism, Martinus says in the book on funerals, is the bond which God uses in order to connect us. And just one part of this journey towards connectedness, that we need to realize we share the same earth. We should see that we are the same people. We all share this existential loneliness at one point, at several points in our lives. And we should realize that some of those old tunnels just belong to the past. But that could be the topic of another lecture, to talk more about that. And of course, this is just something that we need to go through and develop as well. And we have talked about in our study group today also that many people who come here probably have sufferings and pains in this life, but also in earlier lives that are quite fresh, that we perhaps don't remember, but they are there as a kind of unconscious memory, that we carry our earlier lives with us when we come. And that is perhaps why we also long so much for learning more about how life works and how we can overcome this. And we can see that when Martinus, of course, explains to us that it's impossible to understand our lives and our fate without the principle of reincarnation. And he even calls it a miracle that we have reincarnation and karma. It's from the book Intellectualized Christianity. Intellectualized Christendom. Yeah. Is it correct, Mary? I was just unsure. He says, reincarnation or rebirth and karma are the miracle through which God creates the human being in the image of God after his likeness. So it's just to stress again that we have so many lives. This has also been shown earlier on. I think it was Mikael who showed it, that it becomes slightly lighter with each life. It's a long and slow process, but we need to remember that we have this pain and sorrow perhaps with us, even now when we long for the eternal connectedness. And this is part of the process. And this, he says that without the knowledge of reincarnation, it's quite impossible to understand the mystery of life. It's such a basic foundation that you also heard about this morning, that it really needs to be stated. And just to go on to this state of suffering, this is also something that Martinus comes back to. Of course, he quotes the Bible a lot. And he tells us that what is written in the Bible is not just a story about something that happened 2,000 years ago, even if it might have happened exactly in this way, but it's also a process that everyone will go through. So when he writes about, you will probably all recognize Jesus in the Gethsemane garden, which I think it's called, when he, for a moment, despairs and thinks this is too much, and he feels very alone. All the disciples have gone to sleep, perhaps, and he knows that he has suffering in front of him. That this is something that we also need to go through, that we will go through. It's indispensable. It's kind of an inner process or a model, and that's why it's a deep inner truth in the story, which I will use the last part to talk about. He has written a beautiful article called The Garden of Gethsemane, and he puts it like this. What is the modern human being to do when he finds himself in the middle of the darkest hour of his own life, in the middle of his own crucifixion, his own breakdown? He has to mobilize, he gives the answer. This is what we need to try. He has to mobilize his entire intellectual power in order through it to find his way to God's will. God's intention with experienced pain, if the human being does this, he will. He has his he has to find his way to God's will, to God's intention with experienced pain. If the human being does this, he will, like Jesus, conquer all darkness. And it's certainly something that we have talked about. It probably happens many times and not just one time, so we have time to practice this. And our goal, as Martinus puts it, is that this really leads us to a conscious individual relationship to God, where we can re-experience this connectedness. And I will, just in order to illustrate this, we had some illustrations of connectedness in the beginning, and perhaps these are some connection of disconnectedness. Some of you know the Swedish former secretary of, or the Swedish secretary of the United Nations. I guess he was called Secretary General, it's called. Quite famous in the world, and died suddenly in an accident. Some people thought it might have been set-up accident. But when he died, having had this very important job, people discovered that he was also kind of mystic, that he had a deep, deep connection to God. He was a deeply religious and spiritual man, and who wrote small poems and reflections on his job in a book called Waymarks or Markings. And he also expressed self-doubt. He expressed how difficult he thought his mission was. I mean, he was trying to cope with the world in war and try to promote peace and understanding, and felt, as you can understand later on, quite alone, but still quite focused on trying to do this because it was God's will. It was quite shocking to some people that this sort of famous Secretary General also had such a strong spiritual side. But I will just show you one of his poems. It's short, where he, in a way, describes a kind of Gethsemane moment, you could say. And I'll just read it. He says, or he writes, "Tired and lonely, tired, the heart aches. Meltwater trickles down the rocks. The fingers are numb, the knees tremble. It is now that you must not give in. On the path of others are resting places in the sun where they can meet. But this is your path, and it is now that you must not fail. Weep if you can. Weep, but do not complain. The way chose you, and you must be thankful." So he expresses gratitude, but also the difficulties. And this is just another reflection in the same book. "Did you give me this insoluble loneliness so that I would more easily give you everything?" And this is a communication with God that he has in his reflections. So I think it's quite moving that he described his struggles, also his self-doubts and other things so clearly in those reflections, and that many people also can recognize themselves in. And just another example before we will wrap it up with the end, with what happens when we get connected. Martinus also wrote a letter. He wrote many letters, as you know, also personal letters, but a moving letter to a friend who also felt very lonely, partly because he was a homosexual in a time when that was not allowed. And I just let his own words speak. "As far as your loneliness is concerned, I understand it so perfectly well, dear NN. All human beings must sooner or later walk this path. It is the 40 days of wandering in the desert before the real reunion with the Godhead can take place. Without this journey, nobody would get any real practice of giving rather than receiving. It is in this zone that one learns how to give one's life in order to come to own it. So in a way you have the whole process of resurrection here as well. The journey through the materialistic world, the loneliness, feeling disconnected from the Godhead. And Martinus describes this as a necessary, an unavoidable process in order to get this reunion. And this is what we will just look at in the last quotes. Because as we know, and what is perhaps described here in a slightly romantic or naive way, but we know Martinus describes that when we can accept our pain, accept our fate, and leave it in God's hands, just leave all the pain, all the distress that we have in God's hands, he says there will invariably an angel that comes to comfort us, which is illustrated in the tale. And this will come to us as well, and then actually there will be this fantastic turning point. This is just a photo from a clear morning here in Klint. And Martinus says, the person who in every situation can say, Father, not my will, but thy will be done, will have the courage to embrace life and will be able to come through difficulties and dark states. He goes on to say, with God built into all our actions and manifestations, fear will vanish from our path. And in the same way, from our path of life, in the same way that the damp mists of the night vanish as the morning sunshine breaks through. And this is, of course, a cycle that we see every day. This is, as I said, a morning. A few hours later, we had night and darkness, and then just sun rises, and it seems like a miracle. And Martinus says the same miracle will take place in our lives when we go through this process. You could compare it to the prodigal son comes home to his father, showed here in the picture. There could also, of course, be the prodigal daughter. It's the finished human beings. And it shows us how a human being, through this relationship to the Godhead, how this human being is able to struggle through the deepest sorrow, the deepest distress and happiness, and conquest the culmination of darkness itself. So we have two stories. We have the prodigal son, and you have sort of the journey, the prodigal son and the journey that he makes, but also these moments of the Gethsemane garden. And Martinus actually says that this is an inner process that is a fantastic process. And it says it's a fantastic stage where we will, from having always felt the connectedness, going through this state of interconnectedness, he says this is an event, it's a narrative of a spiritual stage, this turning point in the Gethsemane garden, that we can translate in so many ways in our own life. And he says, actually, imagine such a stage. It's like a glory that turns up here when he puts it like that. It's a wonderful stage. It's the stage where we learn to forgive our enemies, when we turn ourselves to the Father again, when we realize, if I give up the unfinished thoughts, the wishes that I have, if I feel I want to just learn how to give instead how to take and receive, then it's a spiritual transformative event. And this will be the last that you see. He says, imagine having spiritually conquered all dark fate, and in every kind of unhappy condition, being able to raise one's eyes towards the Godhead and be most happy in saying, Father, let not my will, but thy will be done. And into thy hands I commend my spirit. And this is what he said, and the cosmic analysis show us that in a way we break out of a mental prison when we can do that. And at that point we also follow the way of Christ, and we will again experience the connectedness that is built in within us and that we actually always have. So he describes this as a fantastic event. It's not easy, it's not without pain, but it's something that we need to go through and that we can be happy that we have to experience and not just move quickly towards the end, where we show here that our goal is to learn how to love one another in this world with all the lessons, with all the teachings that the Godhead has to give us. He says when we realize that God is everything, we will also feel grateful. He actually says that when we start feeling grateful about everyday life, this is the first step towards cosmic consciousness, that we feel this gratefulness. And it's the same gratefulness that the prodigal son felt when he was on his way back to his father. He was quite, not humiliated, but ödmjuk. What's ödmjuk in English? Humble, of course. He was quite humble through all his experiences. It's actually a new person coming back and just longing to work in simple circumstances, grateful for all that the Father could give him. And Martinus describes that this gratefulness is actually the first step towards attaining cosmic consciousness. And then we will again see this absolute reality and realize that we will also, at that part, really feel connected to each other and feel that we love each other and want to touch each other and want to be close to each other. He says here, it's actually, although the living beings themselves do not know this yet, our longing to be together with other people, to touch other people, to love other people. It's a recognition of the identity of our I with the eyes of our fellow beings and the divine kinship based on this, or our cosmic family relationship with all living beings. So, connected again. Thank you so much for your attention. Mm-hmm.